Hey, welcome to a new Tuts Plus tutorial. I'm Adi, and in today's video, we're talking about Flexbox versus CSS Grid and which one you should use and when. Now, there has been, and still is, a lot of chatter on the subject. Some people say that you should always use Flexbox. Others swear that CSS Grid is like the best thing ever. And some people who like pain and suffering and eternal misery claim that CSS floats are the best thing you can use for layouts because they work in IE6. Okay, I made up that last one, but the point is people take this versus thing a little bit too seriously. I mean, both CSS Grid and Flexbox are great tools, and nobody's gonna spank you if you use both, right? So in this tutorial, I'm going to give you my opinion on what each one of these is better suited for and when you should use them. But first, let me ask you this. Did you ever need a website where you can download all sorts of high-quality digital assets with just one subscription? Well, if you have, you should check out Envato Elements, because with one subscription, you'll have unlimited access to WordPress themes and plugins, web and email templates, UI kits, and more. There are millions of digital assets to choose from. They have simple commercial licensing, and you can cancel anytime. Subscribe now using the link in the video description. All right, now back to Flexbox versus CSS Grid. Okay, so one dimension, two dimensions, one axis, two axes. This is what it essentially boils down to. Flexbox is a one-dimensional model, while CSS Grid is a two-dimensional model. And from the math classes, we all know that 2 is bigger than 1 and therefore is better, right? Or is it? Being one-dimensional, Flexbox will lay out the flex items in one direction, the one of the main axis. So you have to decide whether you want a row-based or a column-based layout. You can't really have both. And yes, I know that Flexbox items can wrap on additional rows and columns, but that doesn't make it two-dimensional. Each new row or column is essentially another flex container. Grid layout, on the other hand, is a true two-dimensional model because it lets you work on both the horizontal and the vertical axes, and you can use these to precisely place grid items into cells defined by rows and columns. Based on these facts, people tend to think that grid layout is best for large-scale stuff, like the layout of an entire page, while Flexbox is better for smaller things, like, for example, aligning a piece of text with an icon. That's not entirely true, and you should actually avoid that kind of thinking because it's just going to limit you, and it's going to prevent you from using these tools to their full potential. To give you an example, I'm going to show you a simple layout that you would normally build with Flexbox, but we're going to build it with Grid instead. I'm in CodePen, and I'm going to start with a div class container. Inside, I'm going to create basically 3 cells, 1, 2, 3. Now, when it comes to the CSS, I'm going to target the container, and I'm going to add some padding. This is purely for visual styling. And I'm going to do the same thing for the cell, add a background color and a padding as well, just so you can see these cells a little bit better. Now, let's build this layout with Grid. So I'm going to create a class of Grid, and I'm actually going to add it to my container, like so. And inside, I'm going to set the display to Grid, and I'm going to say Grid template columns, 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. And let's also add a grid gap of 1 rem. Right, so that's your layout. We have 3 equal columns, and you can easily do this with Flexbox, right? In fact, this is the typical example of what you would use Flexbox for. But the thing is, it's much easier to do with grid because I can now change the size of this middle cell to take up twice as much space as the other columns. I can even make it take 3 times as much space as the other columns, right? So it's super simple with grid, and the syntax is very elegant. If we were to do this with Flexbox, we would do the following. Let's create a flex class. We'll set the display to flex. And let's also use the gap property for Flexbox, 1rem. And let's change the class here from grid to flex. So now we're getting our 3 columns, but they are not taking up as much space as we want. We can easily do that by saying flex, and we'll target the immediate cells. And we can set the flex grow property to 1. That means each flex item will take up as much space as possible. And because we have 3 cells or 3 flex items, they're going to take up equal amounts of space. If we want this middle one to take up twice as much space as the others, just like we did with grid, we can do that as well. We can say flex cell, and we can target nth child 2, so the second flex items, and we can say flex grow 2. And it's going to give us the exact same effect. Now, this is the amount of code that we wrote for Flexbox to achieve this layout. And this is the amount of code that we wrote with grid. So as you can see, even though this would be a typical use case for Flexbox, we can do the same thing with grid, and we can even do it better because the syntax is much simpler. Similarly, there are layouts for which you would typically use CSS Grid. For example, a grid system, right? We all know the traditional 12-column grid you can use to place your items in any configuration you want. Well, normally CSS Grid layout would be perfect for this. However, there are CSS frameworks like Bootstrap that use a grid system like this built with Flexbox. So I guess my point is the scale of your project doesn't matter that much. Flexbox and Grid are both good at doing various things, and you don't have to choose one over the other. In fact, there are plenty of situations where you can use both at the same time. For example, this is a card UI created for a tutorial by our fearless web design editor, Ian Yates. In this demo, he uses both CSS Grid and Flexbox to achieve this layout, and it works beautifully. You'll find a link to the full tutorial down below, and I highly recommend you check it out. Now, when deciding which tool you want to use, you must also consider the desired behavior, meaning, do you want to let your content shape your layout? In that case, use Flexbox. Or do you want to let your layout shape your content? In that case, use Grid. So let me show you an example for both situations. First is an example for using Flexbox. I have a container with 5 cells inside, and the first cell has a pretty long text. Now, when using Flexbox, I'm going to do the following. Container. Let's quickly add some padding. And just so you can see these cells a little bit better, I'm going to add a background color and a padding. So back to the container, we're going to set display to flex. We're going to set the flex wrap to wrap so we get new lines. And we'll also set a gap to 1rem. So watch what happens here. Our layout is basically defined by our content. Okay, we now have one large cell on the first row, and the remaining cells are being wrapped on the next row. And I actually forgot to add 4 and 5 here. Okay, so this is a typical example of letting your content shape your layout, in which case, if you want to do that, use Flexbox. Now, I'm going to create a new pen here, and I'm going to use the same HTML, but the CSS will be slightly different. The only common thing between the two is the CSS for the cell. So actually, I'm going to remove these. Now, if we want to let our layout shape the content, we're going to use CSS Grid. So I'm going to set a display to grid on our container. I'm going to add the same 1 rem gap, and I'm going to say grid template columns 1fr, 1fr, 1fr. Now, we have a different story here, right? Let me quickly kind of match the width of this viewport so you can see the differences. This is the layout created with CSS Grid. As you can see in this case, our layout shapes the content, right? So this piece of text is now shaped by the layout, by whatever sizes we have set up for our columns. In this case, when using Flexbox, the content actually shapes the layout. See, because we have a very long text, the browser just places that text in this column and makes the column full width. But in this example, the layout is fixed. It doesn't adapt to the content. Instead, the content adapts to the layout. And the thing with CSS Grid is that you can also use a technique that was introduced by Hayden Pickering in one of his videos, and you'll find a link to that YouTube video down below. Basically, this technique allows you to create responsive layouts using CSS Grid, and it goes something like this. You would say grid template columns, and instead of defining 1fr, 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 or whatever configuration you want, you would say repeat autofill, and you would do a min-max, let's say 20 rems and 1fr. So this will basically make those or that layout responsive, something that isn't really possible when using this approach. This basically tells the browser, hey, I want 3 columns regardless of the viewport size. This code tells, okay, I want as many columns as possible with the minimum width of 20 rems. And you just fill in the rest. And the browser does that. As you can see, the larger the viewport, the more columns I have. The smaller the viewport, the fewer columns I have, essentially making this layout responsive. That's something you can't really do with Flexbox, right? Flexbox will just keep on wrapping these cells onto new rows, but it doesn't even come close to having this type of behavior. So based on these 2 examples, as I was saying, you got to decide, do you let your content shape the layout, then use Flexbox, or do you let your layout shape the content, in which case you use grid layout. Now, let's not forget about box alignment, because one of the big selling points of Flexbox is the ability to align elements very, very easily. Before Flexbox, we had to resort to all sorts of hacks or tricks to get items to align properly. And let's not talk about browser compatibility with those. Pain, suffering, ring a bell. With Flexbox, it's now easier than ever to align items pretty much any way we want with minimal cross-browser compatible code. Now, the alignment properties from the Flexbox specification have been added to a new specification called Box Alignment Level 3. This means they can be used in other specs as well, like grid layout and multi-column. With that said, whenever I need to create a layout that has very specific alignment or space distribution requirements, I always go for Flexbox because it's just easier for me to do that, even though I know that I have roughly the same options in something like Grid. Now, when it comes to browser compatibility, we really have no issues with either of these modules. For Flexbox, we have full browser support across the board, except maybe older versions of IE, but to be honest, I don't really care about IE. And for grid layout, it's roughly the same thing. I would say the browser support is a little bit better for a Flexbox, but the difference is so marginal that it's not even worth mentioning. So yeah, if you're thinking about differentiating between Flexbox and grid layout based on browser support, you shouldn't really, because both are very well supported in all modern browsers. All right, folks, and that's about it for Flexbox versus CSS Grid. There are a few more angles to discuss here, but I want to keep this short, and instead, I'm going to refer you to a great article written by Anna Monis, and you can find the link down below. With that said, thanks very much for watching. I'm Adi, and until next time, take care.